Once upon a time, there was a young princess. Once upon a time, there was a young princess. Her name was Snow White. Her name was Snow White. She had white skin, red cheeks, and black hair. She had white skin, red cheeks, and black hair. Snow White's mother died long ago. Snow White's mother died long ago. So Snow White lived alone with her father. They were very happy together. So Snow White lived alone with her father. They were very happy together. Then one day, the king fell in love. Then one day, the king fell in love. Soon the kingdom had a new queen. Soon the kingdom had a new queen. And Snow White had a new mother. And Snow White had a new mother. Snow White tried to play with her new stepmother. Snow White tried to play with her new stepmother. "Go away!" The queen slammed her bedroom door. "Go away!" The queen slammed her bedroom door. Alone, the queen looked into her magic mirror. Alone, the queen looked into her magic mirror. "Mirror, mirror on the wall," she asked, "who is the fairest of them all?" "Mirror, mirror on the wall," she asked, "who is the fairest of them all?"
"My lady,"
the mirror said,
"you are the fairest woman in the kingdom." "My lady,"
the mirror said,
"you are the fairest woman in the kingdom."
Years passed, and Snow White grew up. Years passed, and Snow White grew up. She often walked through the village. She often walked through the village. She sang songs with children. She sang songs with children. She gave food to poor people. She gave food to poor people. Everyone loved the young princess. Everyone loved the young princess. "Snow White is so beautiful," a woman said. "Snow White is so beautiful," a woman said.
"I wish I could marry her,"
a man said.
"I wish I could marry her,"
a man said. But the queen didn't like Snow White. But the queen didn't like Snow White. She never spent time with the girl. She never spent time with the girl. Instead, she talked to her mirror. Instead, She talked to her mirror. Mirror, I'm the most beautiful woman, right? Mirror, I'm the most beautiful woman, right?
My lady,
The mirror said.
you are indeed quite fair. My lady,
The mirror said.
you are indeed quite fair. But now there's someone more beautiful. But now there's someone more beautiful.
What? The queen shouted at her mirror. What? The queen shouted at her mirror. Who is more beautiful than I am? Who is more beautiful than I am?
Snow White, my lady.
The mirror said.
Snow White, my lady.
The mirror said. The queen was very angry. The queen was very angry. Everyone says Snow White is so pretty. Everyone says Snow White is so pretty. She's so nice, so perfect. She's so nice, so perfect. Well, they will stop saying it soon. Well, they will stop saying it soon. That night, the queen met a hunter in the village. That night, the queen met a hunter in the village. He carried an axe. He carried an axe. The queen whispered in his ear. The queen whispered in his ear. Then she slipped some gold coins into his hand. Then she slipped some gold coins into his hand. The next day, Snow White walked through the village. The next day, Snow White walked through the village. A stranger grabbed her. A stranger grabbed her. "Let me go!" Snow White cried. "Let me go!" Snow White cried. It was the hunter. It was the hunter. He threw Snow White onto a horse. He threw Snow White onto a horse.
Yeah!
He cried as he jumped on.
Yeah!
He cried as he jumped on. The horse reached a dark forest. The horse reached a dark forest. Snow White saw black, tangled branches. Snow White saw black, tangled branches. Then, something else caught her eye. Then, something else caught her eye. An axe hung from the hunter's belt. An axe hung from the hunter's belt. Snow White gulped. Snow White gulped. "Please sir, let me go. I haven't done anything wrong. Please, sir, let me go. I haven't done anything wrong. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Tears slipped down her cheeks. The hunter sighed and stopped the horse. The hunter sighed and stopped the horse.
You poor child,
He said.
you poor child.
He said.
Go, but don't ever return home. Go, but don't ever return home. The Queen wants you dead. The Queen wants you dead.
Snow White gasped. Why? Snow White gasped. Why?
It doesn't matter.
The hunter said.
Just go. It doesn't matter.
The hunter said.
Just go.
Snow White disappeared among the trees. Snow White disappeared among the trees.
Poor Snow White.
The hunter thought.
Poor Snow White.
The hunter thought.
She will never survive in this forest. She will never survive in this forest.
Snow White ran deep into the forest. Snow White ran deep into the forest. Branches pulled her hair. Branches pulled her hair. Thorns scratched her arms and hands. Thorns scratched her arms and hands. Snow White climbed over rocks and tree roots. Snow White climbed over rocks and tree roots. At last, she stopped to rest. At last, she stopped to rest. How big is this forest? Snow White said. How big is this forest? Snow White said. I've walked for hours. Now I'm lost and it's getting late. I've walked for hours. Now I'm lost and it's getting late. Dark shadows stretched across the forest floor. Dark shadows stretched across the forest floor. A chilly wind shook tree branches. A chilly wind shook tree branches. Dead leaves blew through the air. Dead leaves blew through the air. I must find shelter, Snow White said. She looked around. I must find shelter, Snow White said. She looked around. But where? Snap. But where? Snap. Snow White held her breath. Snow White held her breath. She stared into the darkness. She stared into the darkness. Was the hunter coming back for her? Was the hunter coming back for her? Snow White ran. Snow White ran. Branches hit her face. Branches hit her face. Her foot caught a tree root. Her foot caught a tree root. Snow White tumbled down a hill. Snow White tumbled down a hill. When she sat up, she saw a pair of eyes. When she sat up, she saw a pair of eyes. A wolf, she thought. A wolf, she thought. Growling, the wolf stepped closer. Growling, the wolf stepped closer. The wolf looked deep into Snow White's eyes. The wolf looked deep into Snow White's eyes. Suddenly, the wolf's face changed. Suddenly, the wolf's face changed. The wolf wagged its tail and then ran off. The wolf wagged its tail and then ran off.
That was strange,
Snow White thought.
That was strange,
Snow White thought. As Snow White stood up, she saw something. As Snow White stood up, she saw something. A faint light twinkled through the trees. A faint light twinkled through the trees. Snow White gasped. Snow White gasped.
I see a house! I see a house!
Snow White hurried to the house. Snow White hurried to the house. She was shivering with cold. She was shivering with cold. A stack of firewood sat by the door. A stack of firewood sat by the door. In the window, a candle burned brightly. In the window, a candle burned brightly. Snow White bent low to knock on a tiny door. Snow White bent low to knock on a tiny door.
Hello? Is anyone home?
She called.
Hello? Is anyone home?
She called. Snow White pushed the door open. Snow White pushed the door open. A fire crackled in a fireplace. A fire crackled in a fireplace. The room felt warm and cozy. The room felt warm and cozy. There was a long, low table. There was a long, low table. Snow White thought.
7 plates of food?
Snow White thought.
7 plates of food, 7 forks, 7 spoons, and 7 mugs. 7 forks, 7 spoons, and 7 mugs.
Snow White scratched her head. Snow White scratched her head.
There's 7 of everything, and it's all so small. There's 7 of everything, and it's all so small.
Seeing the food made Snow White hungry. Seeing the food made Snow White hungry. She ate from a plate. She ate from a plate. She drank from a mug. She drank from a mug. Then she moved to the next plate and mug. Then she moved to the next plate and mug. Snow White made her way around the entire table. Snow White made her way around the entire table. Then she yawned.
I'm so tired.
Then she yawned.
I'm so tired.
In another room, Snow White found 7 small beds. In another room, Snow White found 7 small beds.
I could sleep forever.
She mumbled.
I could sleep forever.
She mumbled. She lay down on one of the beds. She lay down on one of the beds.
Ooh, too lumpy.
Snow White said.
Ooh, too lumpy.
Snow White said. The second bed was too firm. The second bed was too firm. She made her way through all the beds. She made her way through all the beds. Finally, Snow White found the perfect bed. Finally, Snow White found the perfect bed. She snuggled under the blanket. She snuggled under the blanket. Then she drifted off to sleep. Then she drifted off to sleep. 7 dwarfs stomped into the house. 7 dwarfs stomped into the house. Picks and bags fell to the floor. Picks and bags fell to the floor.
Phew!
One dwarf said.
Working in the mines is hard work. I'm starving. Phew!
One dwarf said.
Working in the mines is hard work. I'm starving.
Me too.
The second dwarf said.
Me too.
The second dwarf said. The third dwarf nodded.
And me.
The third dwarf nodded.
And me.
The dwarf sat down at the table. The dwarf sat down at the table. The fourth dwarf stared at his plate.
Where's my dinner?
The fourth dwarf stared at his plate.
Where's my dinner?
The other dwarfs looked at their plates. There were 7 gasps. The other dwarfs looked at their plates. There were 7 gasps. The 5th dwarf jumped out of his chair.
Somebody robbed us!
The 5th dwarf jumped out of his chair.
Somebody robbed us!
The 7 dwarfs looked under furniture. The 7 dwarfs looked under furniture. They peeked inside the cupboard. They peeked inside the cupboard.
I don't see anyone,
The 6th dwarf said.
and nothing else is missing. I don't see anyone,
The 6th dwarf said.
and nothing else is missing.
Next, the dwarfs searched their dark bedroom. Next, the dwarfs searched their dark bedroom.
Ouch! Who stepped on my foot? Ouch! Who stepped on my foot?
Sorry, Oof! Sorry, Oof!
Pardon me.
Shh, the 7th dwarf said.
Pardon me.
Shh, the 7th dwarf said.
Someone is sleeping in my bed. Someone is sleeping in my bed.
He held out a candle. He held out a candle. The 6 other dwarfs hurried over. The 6 other dwarfs hurried over. They peered at Snow White. They peered at Snow White.
She's beautiful.
One said.
She's beautiful.
One said.
Should we wake her?
Another asked.
Should we wake her?
Another asked. The first dwarf shook his head.
Let her sleep.
The first dwarf shook his head.
Let her sleep.
The 7th dwarf looked around. The 7th dwarf looked around.
But I don't have a bed. But I don't have a bed.
The first dwarf shrugged.
We have 6 other beds.
The first dwarf shrugged.
We have 6 other beds. You can sleep in each one for an hour. You can sleep in each one for an hour. Okay.
The 7th dwarf mumbled.
Okay.
The 7th dwarf mumbled. The next morning, Snow White woke up. The next morning, Snow White woke up. 7 faces stared at her.
Oh my!
She sat up. 7 faces stared at her.
Oh my!
She sat up.
We won't hurt you.
The first dwarf said.
What's your name? We won't hurt you.
The first dwarf said.
What's your name?
Snow White.
She said.
Snow White.
She said.
My name is Dar.
The dwarf said. He introduced the other dwarfs.
My name is Dar.
The dwarf said. He introduced the other dwarfs.
This is Mar. Par. Gar. Zar. Yar. And Star. This is Mar. Par. Gar. Zar. Yar. And Star.
All the dwarfs stared at Snow White. All the dwarfs stared at Snow White.
Where are you from?
Mar asked.
Where are you from?
Mar asked.
Do you have a family?
Par asked.
Do you have a family?
Par asked. Snow White told the dwarfs her story. Snow White told the dwarfs her story. Gar bit his lip.
I never liked the new queen.
Gar bit his lip.
I never liked the new queen.
Zar nodded.
She's awful.
Zar nodded.
She's awful.
The worst.
Yar said.
The worst.
Yar said. A tear fell from Star's eye. A tear fell from Star's eye.
That's the saddest story ever. That's the saddest story ever. Snow White, please stay here with us. Snow White, please stay here with us.
Snow White smiled.
That sounds wonderful.
Snow White smiled.
That sounds wonderful.
We have to be careful.
Dar said.
The queen must not learn that you're alive. We have to be careful.
Dar said.
The queen must not learn that you're alive.
The dwarfs got ready for work. The dwarfs got ready for work.
We'll be back after dark.
Dar said.
Don't let anyone in. We'll be back after dark.
Dar said.
Don't let anyone anyone in.
Okay.
Snow White promised.
Okay.
Snow White promised. Snow White spent the day cleaning the house. Snow White spent the day cleaning the house. By sunset, soup was cooking on the stove. By sunset, soup was cooking on the stove. Snow White smiled.
My new friends will be home soon.
Snow White smiled.
My new friends will be home soon.
Meanwhile, the Queen was standing in front of her mirror. Meanwhile, the Queen was standing in front of her mirror. She laughed loudly. Now, I'm the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. Right, mirror? She laughed loudly. Now, I'm the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. Right, mirror?
No, my lady.
The mirror said.
No, my lady.
The mirror said.
There is someone 1,000 times more beautiful. There is someone 1,000 times more beautiful.